The beer bottle shattered against the wall, missing her face by inches. Alina Hayes stood frozen behind the bar counter, glass shards scattering across her white shirt, cheap whiskey dripping down her cheek like tears. She refused to cry. The man who threw it, a mountain of muscle with a faded Navy anchor tattooed on his forearm, was laughing. His buddies joined in, their voices filling the cramped Virginia Beach dive bar like wolves circling wounded prey. "Clean it up, sweetheart," he sneered, slamming another empty glass on the counter. "That's what you're good for, right? Cleaning up after real warriors." Alina said nothing. She grabbed the rag from her apron, got down on her knees, and started picking up the broken glass. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else entirely, something she was fighting very hard to suppress. One of the men, younger, cockier, with a seal trident pin on his jacket, leaned over the bar and grabbed a fistful of her ponytail, yanking her head back so she was forced to look up at him. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Mouse. You deaf or just stupid?" The bar went quiet, not because anyone was going to help her, but because they wanted to watch. Alina's jaw tightened. Her eyes, gray, cold, unblinking, locked onto his for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away, letting him release her hair with a satisfied grunt. "That's what I thought, pathetic." The group erupted in laughter again, ordering another round, already forgetting the quiet bartender they had just humiliated. But Alina Hayes wasn't forgetting anything. She was remembering every face, every voice, every word, and one conversation happening in the corner booth that none of them realized she had been listening to for the past 47 minutes. To everyone in that bar, Alina Hayes was nobody. 26 years old, orphaned at 14, raised in the foster system across 3 states, dropped out of community college. No family, no connections, no future. Just another quiet girl pulling beer taps for $7.50 an hour, hopping to pay rent by the 15th. That's what they saw. That's what they were supposed to see. But Alina Hayes had a past that didn't exist in any database. When she was 17, a man in a gray suit visited her group home in Norfolk. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain why he was there. He simply handed her her file, and asked one question. How would you like to disappear and become someone useful? For the next 6 years, Alina trained in places that officially didn't exist: counterintelligence, behavioral analysis, micro-expression reading, language pattern recognition. She learned to hear conversations across crowded rooms by reading lips. She learned to identify lies by watching the dilation of pupils, the twitch of fingers, the rhythm of breathing. She became what the agency called a ghost listener, an operative who could extract information in plain sight without anyone ever knowing she was listening. At 23, she was deployed to Eastern Europe, where she spent 2 years identifying foreign assets embedded in American military networks. At 25, she was burned. An operation went wrong. Her cover was compromised. The agency pulled her out, gave her a new identity, and told her to disappear for real this time. No pension, no protection, no acknowledgement, just a new social security number and a one-way bus ticket to Virginia Beach. Now she poured drinks for drunk sailors and pretended to be invisible. But old instincts never die. And tonight, those instincts were screaming. The man in the corner booth had been nursing the same whiskey for over an hour. He was older than the others, early 40s, lean, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of high-stakes operations. His clothes were expensive but understated. No jewelry, no visible tattoos. But Alina had noticed 3 things the moment he walked in. First, his watch, a Rolex Submariner, authentic, not a replica. That was a $30,000 timepiece on the wrist of a man who supposedly earned a government salary. Second, his phone. He kept it face down at all times, tilting it only slightly when checking messages. The screen brightness was set to minimum, classic counter-surveillance behavior. And third most damning, his companion. The man sitting across from him was speaking Russian. Not loudly, not carelessly, just a few words here and there mixed into English sentences, testing the waters. And the older man was responding fluently. Alina had been reading their lips for 47 minutes, piecing together fragments of a conversation that made her blood run cold. They were discussing troop movements, deployment schedules, names of SEAL team operatives currently embedded in Eastern Europe. The older man wasn't just a traitor. He was one of the most senior intelligence liaisons attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. And he was selling American lives for money. The younger SEALs at the bar had no idea what was happening 10 feet behind them. They were too busy mocking Alina, too busy celebrating a deployment they'd survived, too busy believing they were the most dangerous people in the room. They weren't. Alina wiped down the counter slowly, her eyes tracking the two men in the booth through the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The Russian was sliding a small envelope across the table. The American was reaching for it. This was the handoff. This was her moment. Alina's hand moved casually beneath the counter, retrieving the burner phone she kept taped under the register. She angled it carefully, using her body to block the motion, and pressed record. 30 seconds, that's all she needed. But then the younger SEAL, the one who had grabbed her hair, slammed his palm on the counter, making her flinch. "Hey Mouse, another round, you deaf." The noise drew attention. The man in the booth looked up. His eyes swept the room and landed directly on Alina. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, not of her personally, but of what she was doing. He knew. The next 3 seconds happened in slow motion. The Russian reached inside his jacket. The American stood abruptly, knocking over his glass. The younger SEALs, finally sensing something wrong, turned toward the booth. And Alina Hayes made a decision that would change everything. She vaulted over the bar counter, grabbed the nearest beer bottle, and hurled it directly at the overhead light above the booth. The bulb exploded, glass rained down, the room plunged into chaos. In the darkness, Alina moved like smoke, low, fast, silent. She closed the distance to the booth in under 2 seconds, sliding beneath a table, coming up behind the Russian just as he pulled a compact pistol from his jacket. Her elbow connected with his throat. He dropped. The American tried to run. He didn't get far. Alina swept his legs from behind, sending him crashing into a table. Before he could recover, she was on top of him, her knee pinning his chest, her phone shoved into his face, still recording. "Smile," she whispered. "You're going to be famous." The bar lights flickered back on. 20 people stood frozen, staring at the quiet bartender who had just incapacitated 2 armed men in under 10 seconds. The young SEAL, the one who had grabbed her hair, was standing 3 feet away, his mouth hanging open like a broken door. Alina didn't look at him. She was too busy securing the envelope the American had been reaching for, an envelope containing classified naval intelligence worth millions on the black market. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the police. But it wasn't the police who arrived first. It was a black SUV with government plates and 2 men in gray suits who looked at Alina like they had been expecting her all along. 48 hours later, Commander David Mercer, the traitor, was in federal custody, facing charges of espionage, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder. The Russian operative was identified as a GRU handler responsible for recruiting American assets across 3 continents. And Alina Hayes was sitting in a windowless room at Langley, across from the same man in the gray suit who had recruited her 9 years earlier. He slid a folder across the table. "You were supposed to stay invisible," he said. Alina shrugged. "I got bored." He almost smiled. We need you back officially this time, full reinstatement, new cover, new mission. Elena looked at the folder, then at him. What about the SEALs at the bar? They've been briefed, he interrupted. Partially. They know you're not a bartender. They know you saved their lives. That's all they need to know. Elena nodded slowly. And the one who grabbed my hair. The man in the gray suit leaned back. He requested to be assigned to your security detail. Said he wanted to apologize in person. Elena laughed a real laugh, for the first time in months. Tell him to bring coffee, black, no sugar. She opened the folder. A new name, a new identity, a new mission. The quiet girl was gone. The ghost listener was back. But something had changed in those 48 hours. Something Elena couldn't quite name. She sat in her new apartment, temporary housing, while the agency processed her reinstatement and stared at the wall. The folder sat unopened on the coffee table. Inside were details of her next assignment. A deep-cover operation in the Middle East. High risk, high reward. The kind of mission that could end careers or make legends. She should have been excited, relieved even. She was back. She mattered again. But all she could think about was the look on that young SEAL's face when the lights came back on. Not the shock, not the embarrassment. The shame. He had grabbed her by the hair, called her mouse, humiliated her in front of his friends, and when the truth came out, when he realized what she really was, the shame had hit him like a freight train. Elena had seen it before. Men who underestimated women, men who mistook silence for weakness, men who learned too late that the world doesn't owe you respect just because you wear a uniform. She had been invisible for so long. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The burner phone on the counter buzzed, a single text from an unknown number. Coffee's ready, whenever you are, Petty Officer Jake Morrison. Elena stared at the message for a long moment. Then she grabbed her jacket and walked out the door. The coffee shop was small, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop on the outskirts of Virginia Beach. Jake Morrison was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of black coffee and the kind of nervous energy that came from not knowing how this conversation was going to go. He stood when she walked in, not out of formality, out of respect. "Elena," he said quietly. She sat down across from him, taking the coffee without a word. Jake sat back down, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with why you're here," Elena said. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, the kind of edge that came from years of being underestimated. Jake exhaled slowly. "Because I was an asshole, because I treated you like garbage, and because if I don't say this to your face, I'll never forgive myself." Elena sipped her coffee, waited. "I thought I was hot shit," Jake continued. "I thought because I wore the trident, because I'd seen combat, because I'd survived Hell Week, that I was better than everyone else. Better than you." He looked down at his hands. "I grabbed you by the hair. I called you a mouse. I humiliated you in front of everyone. And when I found out who you really were, what you'd done, I realized something." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I realized I'm the mouse, not you." Elena didn't respond. She just watched him, her gray eyes unreadable. Jake leaned forward. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to like me. But I need you to know that what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. She turned the coffee cup in her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. Then she spoke. "You know what the hardest part of being undercover is?" Jake shook his head. "It's not the danger. It's not the loneliness. It's the fact that you have to let people treat you like you're nothing. You have to stand there and take it, because if you fight back, if you show even a fraction of who you really are, your cover's blown, and people die." She looked up at him. "So yes, Jake, you were an asshole, you treated me like garbage, but you're not the first, and you won't be the last." Jake's jaw tightened. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Elena agreed. It doesn't, but here's the thing, you're here, you apologized. That's more than most people would do. She took another sip of coffee. So I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell myself every time someone underestimates me. Use it. Use the anger. Use the shame. Use the memory of how it felt to be wrong, and become someone better. Jake nodded slowly. I want to. That's why I requested the security detail. I figured if I'm going to learn anything, I should learn from the best. Alina raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? I'm not easy to work with. Jake smiled for the first time. Good. I don't want easy, I want to be better. Alina studied him for a moment longer. Then she extended her hand across the table. All right, Morrison, you've got one chance, don't waste it. Jake shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. I won't. As they sat there in that small coffee shop, Alina realized something. She had spent so long being invisible, so long being underestimated, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be acknowledged. Not as a weapon, not as an asset, but as a person. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The world had taught her that silence was survival, that being invisible was the only way to stay safe. But what if there was another way? What if instead of hiding who she was, she could use it to build something better? She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. The mission briefing came 3 days later. Alina sat in a secure conference room at Langley, surrounded by men in suits and uniforms who spoke in acronyms and code names. The target was a high-value asset embedded deep within a terrorist network operating out of Syria. The asset had been feeding intelligence to the U.S. for over a year, but his cover was blown. Extraction was necessary, time-sensitive, high risk. Alina was the extraction specialist. Jake Morrison was her security liaison. The man in the gray suit, whose name, she had learned, was Victor Cross, laid out the parameters. You'll be inserted via commercial flight into Turkey, then overland into Syria. Your cover is a humanitarian aid worker with an NGO operating in the region. Morrison will be posing as your logistics coordinator. Victor slid a photograph across the table. A middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes stared back at her. This is Asset Nightingale. Real name, Dr. Karim Said. He's a Syrian physician who's been treating wounded civilians in Aleppo while simultaneously passing intel to our handlers. But 3 days ago, his contact was compromised. We have reason to believe enemy forces are closing in. Alina studied the photograph. What's his exfil window? 72 hours, Victor said. After that, he's as good as dead. Alina nodded. What's the row? Rules of engagement are defensive only, Victor replied. You're there to extract, not engage. If you're compromised, you abort and exfil immediately. Alina leaned back in her chair. And if Nightingale refuses to leave? Victor's expression didn't change. Then you leave without him. We don't trade American lives for uncooperative assets. Alina glanced at Jake, who was sitting across from her, his jaw set, his eyes focused. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he kept tapping his finger against his knee, but he was trying to hide it. Any questions? Victor asked. Jake raised his hand slightly. What's the threat level on the ground? High, Victor said bluntly. The region is contested territory, multiple factions, minimal rule of law. If you're compromised, you're on your own. No air support, no cavalry, just you and whatever you can carry. Jake nodded slowly. Understood. Victor turned to Alina. You've operated in the region before. What's your assessment? Alina considered the question carefully. It's doable, but we'll need local support. Someone who knows the terrain, someone we can trust. Victor slid another photograph across the table. A woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, eyes sharp and calculating. This is Layla Haddad, former Syrian intelligence, now working with us as a contractor. She'll be your guide on the ground. Alina studied the photograph. There was something about Layla's eyes, a hardness that came from seeing too much, surviving too much, that Alina recognized instantly. "She reliable?" Alina asked. "As reliable as anyone in that region can be," Victor replied. "She's gotten 3 of our assets out alive in the past 18 months, but she's also been burned twice. She knows the risks." Alina nodded. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow night," Victor said. "You'll have 48 hours to prep. Morrison, you'll be briefed separately on the logistics. Alina, you'll work with our language and culture team to refine your cover. Any final questions?" Jake and Alina exchanged a glance. Then, simultaneously, they shook their heads. Victor stood, closing the folder in front of him. "Good, dismissed." As they walked out of the conference room, Jake fell into step beside Alina. "You ever done anything like this before?" Alina glanced at him. "A few times, you." "First time," Jake admitted. "I've done extraction ops before, but never in hostile territory like this." Alina stopped walking, turning to face him. "Listen to me, Morrison. In 48 hours, we're going to be in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. There won't be time for second-guessing. There won't be room for hesitation. If I tell you to move, you move. If I tell you to shoot, you shoot. And if I tell you to leave me behind, you leave me behind. Understood?" Jake met her eyes. "I won't leave you behind." Alina's expression softened slightly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." They continued walking in silence until they reached the parking lot. As Jake headed toward his truck, Alina called out to him. "Morrison." He turned. "Get some sleep tonight. You're going to need it." Jake nodded. "You too." Alina watched him drive away, then got into her own car. She sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing in particular. 48 hours. Then everything would change again. She started the engine and drove into the night. The flight into Istanbul was uneventful. Alina and Jake traveled separately, maintaining their cover identities. Alina posed as Sarah Mitchell, a logistics coordinator for a small NGO focused on medical relief. Jake was her assistant, David Harper, responsible for supply chain management. They met at a prearranged safe house on the outskirts of the city, a small apartment overlooking the Bosphorus, rented under a shell corporation that couldn't be traced back to the agency. Layla Haddad was already there when they arrived. She was smaller than Alina expected, barely 5'4", but she moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of operating in hostile environments. Her eyes swept over Alina, and Jake with the practiced assessment of someone who knew how to identify threats. "Sarah Mitchell," Alina said, extending her hand. Layla shook it, her grip firm. "Layla, I'll be your guide." Jake introduced himself as David, and Layla gave him the same appraising look she'd given Alina. "You're military," Layla said flatly. Jake hesitated. "Former." Layla smirked. "You can always tell. The posture, the way you scan a room, don't worry. Out there it won't matter. Everyone's military. Everyone's a threat." She moved to the table in the center of the room, where a detailed map of northern Syria was spread out. Red circles marked key locations. Blue lines indicated safe routes. Black X's marked areas to avoid. "We cross the border here," Layla said, pointing to a remote crossing near the Turkish-Syrian border. "It's controlled by a local militia that's sympathetic to our cause, for a price." "How much?" Alina asked. 5,000 US each, Layla replied. "Cash, no questions." Alina nodded. "And once we're across?" "We have a 4-hour drive to Aleppo," Layla said. "The roads are bad, checkpoints everywhere. We'll be traveling with a convoy of aid trucks to blend in. Once we reach the city, we make contact with Nightingale and extract within 12 hours. Jake frowned. 12 hours, that's a tight window. "It's the only window we have," Layla said. "Any longer and we risk getting caught in the crossfire. There's fighting in the city every night. Airstrikes, artillery. If we're not out by dawn, we won't get out at all. Alina studied the map carefully. What about enemy forces? Who controls the city? Everyone and no one, Layla replied. Government forces hold the west. Rebel factions control the east. ISIS is still operating in pockets to the south, and there are at least 3 different militias vying for territory. It's a war zone, and it changes every day. Jake let out a slow breath. So we're walking into a meat grinder. Layla looked at him. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing. If you're not ready for that, speak now. Jake met her gaze. I'm ready. Layla nodded, then turned to Alina. What about you? Alina's eyes never left the map. I've been in worse. Layla smiled faintly. Good. Then we leave at 0400. Get some rest while you can. They crossed the border just before dawn, hidden among crates of medical supplies in the back of a battered cargo truck. The militia guards barely glanced at their papers before waving them through. Layla had been right, money talked louder than questions. The drive to Aleppo was brutal. The roads were cratered from years of bombardment. Burned-out vehicles lined the shoulders like grave markers. Every few miles, they passed checkpoints manned by armed men who stared at them with hollow, suspicious eyes. Alina sat in the back of the truck, her hand resting on the pistol concealed beneath her jacket. Jake sat across from her, his face pale, his jaw set. This was his first time in a war zone that wasn't controlled by the U.S. military. No air support, no backup, just survival. Layla drove in silence, her eyes constantly scanning the road ahead. They reached the outskirts of Aleppo just after noon. The city was a graveyard, buildings reduced to rubble, streets empty except for the occasional scavenger picking through the ruins. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the air like thunder. Layla pulled the truck into an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city and killed the engine. We're here, she said quietly. Alina and Jake climbed out, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The air smelled of smoke and decay. Layla pulled out a sat phone and made a quick call, speaking in rapid Arabic. When she hung up, she turned to Alina and Jake. Nightingale is in a clinic 2 miles from here. We go on foot. Stay close, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, don't stop running. They moved through the ruins like shadows, keeping to the walls, avoiding open streets. Every few minutes, Layla would raise a fist and they would freeze, listening. Then she would move again and they would follow. After 30 minutes, they reached the clinic, a half-collapsed building with faded Red Cross symbols painted on the walls. Layla knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times. The door opened. A man in his 50s stood in the doorway, his face lined with exhaustion, his hands stained with blood. Dr. Karim Said, Asset Nightingale. He looked at Layla, then at Alina and Jake. You're here to take me away. Alina nodded. We are, but we need to move now. Karim shook his head slowly. I can't leave, not yet. There are patients inside, children. If I leave, they die. Alina felt her chest tighten. Doctor, if you stay, you die, and everyone you've helped dies with you. Karim's eyes filled with tears. Then let me die saving them. And in that moment, Alina understood something she had been running from her entire life. Sometimes courage isn't about surviving. It's about choosing who you save.